Hello folks, thank you for joining us on this session of plugin development. So I'm David, I'm joined by Marcus. Together we work on Grafana's plugins platform and the catalog of available plugins. So today we're going to cover three main areas. Firstly, we'll give you a general overview to plugins, what they are, why you might want to create one. Then we'll actually show you how to do it. So it's kind of like a teaser to this workshop that I've now been signed up for without really volunteering it. It's just a single command. We'll take you through creating a new data source. And then as this is going to be a fairly fast-paced talk, the intent here is that we'll provide you links and pointers on where to go next so that it kind of serves to jumpstart your plugin development journey. You can also find us at Ask the Experts or in our community Slack forum. So if you have questions, come find us. Hopefully you've seen some of the new exciting features like the app platform that are coming. For this talk, we're very much grounding it in what is available today and the current experience. So, very much basics. What is a plugin? A plugin is a way that you extend Grafana, or its built-in capabilities. And how exactly? Well, this is where we get into what we're calling plugin types. And there are three types of plugins. There's data sources, there's panels, and there's apps. If we ground it in what people are hopefully familiar with already, so even if you've not developed a plugin, hopefully you know what a dashboard looks like. So dashboards are made up of a series of panels. When you edit a panel, you kind of see something like this. For a dashboard, first we need data to display. So down at the bottom left, for folks that can't see that, we have the query for a given data source. Good one. Once we have that data, we need a way to display it. So that users quickly understand what is going on and they can take actions based on those insights, and we pick an appropriate visualization to work with the type of data that we're interested in. Additional visualizations can be added through panel plugins, and then how you actually tweak the behavior of the visualization is through the panel options. So just through this dashboard, we've introduced the first two types of plugins that we're going to talk about. And if we look more closely at data sources, the three primary capabilities of a data source come down to like these things. Firstly, the ability to configure a connection to a given service, like a database. That can be things like passing an auth token alongside the requests or selecting a cloud region. And then once you have that connection, providing the mechanism to construct a valid query and actually issue the request. And finally, when you get the response, you need to be able to convert it into a consistent data format so it can then be used by all of those different visualizations. Like through a data source, and this was kind of alluded to with our Big Tent philosophy, you provide the ability for Grafana to get data from anything, whether that's something with a REST API, a WebSocket, whether it's like bespoke within your org, publicly accessible, doesn't matter. And the great thing is you can leave your data where it lives today without having to migrate it. If we look at the capabilities in a bit more detail, so this is how you actually configure a connection. And say your underlying service needs the user to authenticate before they can retrieve data, or you want to provide customization on the connection itself. The way you do this is through the config editor. And by the way, we'll make all of these slides available, so if you can't see things in detail, don't worry, you'll be able to see it later. This is an example of the config editor. This is from the Prometheus data source, and one of the custom things that you can do here is you can change the scrape interval. So this is how users interact it when they create a new data source instance in Grafana. The actual request to the service can be defined either in the front end or the back end of your data source. Marcus will discuss that a little bit later. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the user-facing aspects. So the other main user-facing aspect of the data source is the query editor. So this is what shows when you're in a panel edit, as I was before, or you're in the Explore view. It can be a simple Monaco code editor, or you can provide a builder. You can do things like autocomplete, links for help. There's loads that you can do to kind of make it easier for the user to construct a valid request. In the data source, you transform the response into a consistent data format, which we call data frames. We're not able to go into too much details on these, but I have links and docs that you can go to get started. Again, they're defined in the front end or the back end as part of actually handling the query itself. And we provide helper functions which allow you to make this like really easy, so you can construct the data frames no matter what format your target data is in. Now you've got the data, you've got to visualize it, and this is where panels come in. So if there's a visualization type that's not already covered in the panels that we have, or you want to do something bespoke, interactive in the front end, maybe not even relating to querying a data source, you can just have it as a widget, you can create a panel plugin. Going back to the dashboard from before, two main features, the visualization and the options to configure it. So for your visualization, using the props, you can basically react to the changes in the sizes of a panel within a dashboard, as well as the query being passed from the data source to the front end. And then you can use this information to craft an appropriate means to display something to the user. This is a really simple example from Create Plugin that just creates a circle. Then to actually allow users to configure how the visualization behaves, so like if you've got thresholds defined, how you want to change the behavior there, you do that through panel options. This is usually defined in the module TS file, and that is the entry point for any plugin, so that's the first thing that loads. The third type of plugin, which we've not yet covered and gets a bit more interesting, is apps. So apps are somewhat special in terms of their flexibility, but you can kind of think of apps as providing these three distinct features. So firstly, you can create completely custom pages, which are accessible from the Grafana navigation, and you can use our scenes library. So you've seen this is starting to get used in dashboards as the new way that we actually render dashboards. Secondly, within the application, you can create multiple components. So your app can include a data source and X number of panels, but you distribute it as a single binary or a single artifact. But all of those subcomponents exist as they would if they were externally published. So they're generally available within Grafana and within your app. And finally, this is a relatively recent addition, which we quite like, UI extensions. So this is where an application can register its functionality to different parts of the Grafana UI and other plugins. So you basically expose your functionality within a user's current context. Examples of this are like the incident app. So if you're in a panel, through the panel menu, you can declare an incident from there, and then it gets the link to that panel straight from the point of creating the incident. So it kind of jumpstarts the creation of these things, but also provides good breadcrumbs to users of what's important. This is an example of one of the custom pages from our front-end observability app, and this is using scenes. So you can see some of the features that you get, like tabs for organizing the content. You've got the time picker up at the right, so you kind of get dashboard-like experiences, and they're really easy to build just using the scenes library. As I mentioned, so apps can either leverage or depend on an external data source, or you can bundle it all within the app itself. We call this nested plugins. This shows what it kind of looks like from a folder structure. You have the data source folder. It has its own plugin JSON, so that's the definition of any plugin. Within the app itself, we also have a plugin JSON for the app. Then Grafana will load these as individual plugins. Apps can also include a custom backend component, and this basically gives you the ability to write any API request you like. So you can grab data, you can issue a command. Some of the examples that we have are using it as like a wrapper for another API server. So this is how the ML app works, for example. And finally, we have UI extensions. So this is just to actually show you what this looks like today. So if you go to the Explore page, we've made the Add button an extension point, so any application can register functionality there. So any query that gets executed in Explore can then be used to jumpstart a workflow from an extension point. So you can create a forecast based on the data. You can detect outliers. You can declare an incident. Right, now I'm going to head over to Marcus to talk about anatomy.
Cool. So let's talk a bit about the anatomy of a plugin. All plugins has a plugin.json file, and it's basically a static metadata information file that contains all information necessary to run and to work with the plugin. In this illustration, we have a front-end only data source. So as in addition to what David mentioned earlier with the query editor and the config editor, we also have a check health and a query data functionality. The check health is being used to verify that the plugin is correctly configured and working as expected. And the query data is used to run the query that the user has defined in the query editor. Then we have a data source with backend, so they are similar. The only difference is that we only have the query editor and the config editor on the front end, and we implement the check health and the query data in the backend. In addition, if you have a backend, you can also add something that we call call resource, and it's basically a capability to provide custom endpoints. So things such as provide support data to build your query editor, or whatever could be needed. Then we have panel plugins. So it's only implemented on the front end. It has two main components. So it's the panel itself, which visualizes the data, and then I have panel options, which David mentioned. So everything you need to be able to configure that panel, how it's going to behave and how it's going to visualize the data. Then we have front-end only apps. So there we only have a root page, which is the page that user can end in. If you want to have a custom navigation, this is where you define it. And then I have a config page, and it's basically just to be able to configure the app and enable or disable it. You can also have plugins, app plugins with backend. So it's basically the same thing. You have the root page, the config page on the front end, but in addition, you have check health, and you also have the call resource functionality, which you can use to provide custom endpoints for your front-end part. So now we have some basic understanding of the different parts of a plugin. So to speed up development and to have a consistent UI and to be able to share functionality within Grafana, but also with all of the plugin developers external to Grafana, we have the Grafana packages. So we have Grafana UI. It's basically a component library consisting of small to medium-sized UI building blocks. We use it internally to build Grafana. So if you use it, you're gonna automatically have the same look and feel as Grafana. Then we have the Grafana data package, which contains shared types and structures. It contains core functionality such as data frame support and value formatters. And finally, we have the Grafana runtime. It provides functionality and information about the current running Grafana instance. One example would be to use the data source SRV to fetch all the current configured and installed data sources from the current running Grafana instance. So, do I need a backend for my plugin? It depends. So if you're building a panel plugin, you don't need that, since you're only working in front end. If you are targeting APIs that you want to communicate with in the plugin that are that can be connected from a browser, then you might not need a backend. But if you want to enable, for example, Grafana alerting, or you want to connect to some API that can't be connected from the browser, or if you want to keep state between users, use some custom security checks that we don't support out of the box, or provide custom endpoints, then you need a backend. I guess the only drawback with having a backend is that you need to write the plugin in 2 languages. So you need to write the front end in TypeScript and the backend in Golang. So if you choose to have a backend, we also have a building block for that, and it's the Grafana plugin SDK Go package. So it will give you a bunch of structure, contract, and building blocks to build backend plugins quickly and easy. You will get instance management out of the box, so you don't have to really care about that. Grafana will just run the plugin for you. And you will have a bunch of utility and functionality to transform the data that you receive from the upstream service into data frames, which is really nice. So let's try to create a plugin. We're going to do this live, so we're going to switch computers. I prepared something on this computer, so let's see if this works. See if we get any picture. Okay, cool. We have a pretty neat tool called Create Plugin, which you can use to scaffold a plugin. You just run it by typing this in your prompt of your choice. It's going to ask you a bunch of questions. So when you answer the questions, we're going to tailor a plugin specific to your needs. So we're going to call this one demo. GrafanaCON can be an organization, demo. So I'm going to create a data source. I would like to have a backend. I would like to have release and CI flows. We can skip the Grafana API compatibility stuff. So what this is going to do is just basically going to create a plugin or a template for a plugin for you. So you're basically ready to go. In the end here, you see full instructions on what to do next. So you get instruction on how to build, run, and set up your local development environment. I've already done that, so I'm going to skip this step just to save some time. So this is my local instance. I have scaffolded a plugin prior to this. We have also added some capabilities to that plugin. So it's a data source plugin with a backend. It won't connect to any external data source or an external upstream service. It will generate data directly on the backend, just to make it more demo-proof. So if I go into the demo dashboard, I have 2 panels and a really simple data source plugin. So that is up and running. So let's see what we have, what Create Plugin has scaffolded for us. So I'm gonna go into this directory. I'm gonna open the editor. Can you see the text? Yeah. So I'm not gonna go into everything. I'm just gonna cover the main parts. So in the SRC folder, we have the front-end part of the plugin. In the package folder, we have the back-end part of the plugin. In the GitHub/workflows folders, we have the CI and release workflows that are provided for you. Only available if you version your plugin in GitHub, just so we know that. Then also we are provided a bunch of build scripts and all of that, but also a Docker Compose, which makes it super easy to run the plugin locally. It's going to bring up a Grafana instance. It's going to pre-install the plugin. It's going to enable hot loading and provide a good developer experience. So let's have a look at the entry point in the front end of the plugin. So everything starts in the module.ts, and this is basically the same for all plugins. But in this case, we are creating a data source plugin. We have implemented a data source instance locally. We have implemented a config editor and a query editor. So let's quickly jump into data source. So since I created a data source with a backend, I am extending the data source with the backend, which will basically give me everything for free. So I don't need to implement any logic to connect to the backend. It will be provided for me. All I need to implement is a function which is going to return a default query that will be used in the query editor. And then also I have added a get available datasets function. This is optional, and I'm going to go into detail about this a bit later. So let's go back to the module.ts and visit the config editor. So if we jump over to Grafana and we do data source, we go into the data source config editor. So this is the data source config editor for this plugin. It's super simple. We basically have 2 sections. It's general, which provide a time field, and it's API settings, which provide the user, which is a secure API key. So why we picked these 2 is because we have part of the data that can be available for everyone, which is the general, and then we have the API settings, which is secure and shouldn't be shared to the front end. So let's go and see how that looks in code. So this is the React component for the config editor. As I said, we have two types of data. So we have the general part, which is the time field, and we have the API settings, which contain the API key. These components here, they are imported from the Grafana UI library, so that's why they have that look and feel. And I think important to highlight here is for non-secure data, you can store it in JSON data. For secure data, you should store it in secure JSON data. The values in secure JSON data, obvious, yeah, aren't returned to the client. So we don't really know what value is set. So for that, we use secure JSON fields, which basically is the key value, returning the fields and a Boolean value whether or not that one is set. So in this case, we figure out if the secret input is in configure or not by using the secure JSON fields. So when the plugins start, I'm going to jump to the backend part. We have this factory function being called. So the secrets are passed when the plugin is started, and we are using those to load them into a structured model that looks similar to the one that we basically going to contain the two fields that we defined in the config editor. Then we are referencing that one in the data source instance for later use. So it can be used, for example, when we send a query to the backend, or when calling check health, for example. If any of the values are changed, Grafana will reinitialize the instance. So the new values will be passed to it, and it's going to basically start up a new instance with the latest values. So it's going to be cared for. So no worries to store those settings for later use. So if we write something here, time, and we do we try to do save and test, we can see that the data source is working. So what's happened under the hood is that we have called the check health functionality in the backend. It's basically just a Go function that you implement in your plugin. This one isn't doing it so much, just returning OK. But preferably, you would check that you actually can connect to your target service. You could use the settings that we created earlier to do that. So yeah. Cool. So now we have configured a data source. Let's jump back to the query editor. So I'm going to go back to the dashboard, and we're going to go here. So this is, again, it's a super simple use case. We only have a query editor with a drop-down. It's going to display different data sets, and when I select here, it's basically just going to update and rerun the query. So let's jump over to the query editor. So the query editor also uses the components from Grafana UI. Yeah. And we have the data for that component. We will have data source, query, on change, and on run query passed to it. So these are props that we're going to use in this component. Every time we change the data source, change the value of the dropdown, we're going to call the on-change datasets with a new value. And then we're going to create a new query using the old values with the new value, and then execute the query. Also, what we can see, the options here, they are being fetched from use datasets. So use datasets are using the data source. So if we jump to that one, we can see that we are calling the get available datasets, which I talked about earlier. And this one is using a custom resource, so it's going to call the /datasets, which is implemented in the backend to fetch that data to use it in the query editor. So let's quickly have a look how that look. So here we're connecting the datasets endpoint with the handle datasets request function. Again, super simple function. We are just returning the list of available datasets and shipping it back to the front end. But here you can imagine that you maybe would query the upstream service to figure out like what's available schemas that I can provide for the query editor, so I can provide a good experience in writing queries. And then finally, when we have created the query, we have the query data function. So the query data, it's what's being called when you execute the query. Grafana gonna pass the query from the panel in this case. We create a response, we run the query, and then we return it. I'm gonna jump quickly into the run query, just to see, because that's where the interesting bit's happening. So we are parsing the values from the query into a query model. Then we are using that query model to create the fake data that I thought about. Using the query the value that I created in the query, so data set, we either create time series, table, or I also have log frames. In this case, we have a look at the table frame, and this is a super simple example of how you can create data frames. So you add fields to it, you add the values, and then you create a frame, give it a name, and pass it the fields. So I think this is the final part of the demo. So I'm going to hand over to you, David. So you're going to wrap this up.
There we go. So Create Plugin is the tool that Marcus used to scaffold a new data source, and basically this allows you to run a single command down there, npx/grafana/create-plugin at latest. You can create a new data source, new panel, a new application. It provides out-of-the-box Docker-composed development environment, so whenever you make a change in the front end or the back end, we'll do an automatic rebuild and a reload, so it's really easy to do fast iteration. It includes literally everything you need out of the box, including testing libraries for unit tests and end-to-end tests, sneak preview to what we're going to talk about in a second, and GitHub Actions to make it easy to do CI and actually release a new version. So this is going to be very quick, apologies. We're going to have to blitz through this. One thing that we released on Friday, because it's really fun to release major versions of things on a Friday afternoon, plugin E2E is now version 1.0, so this is a brand new library for scaffolding end-to-end tests for plugins. It's based on the open source tool, the framework Playwright, and it makes it really easy to build tests which will target multiple versions of Grafana, catering for the changes in Grafana's UI between those versions. So you can ensure that your plugin continues to work against multiple releases in Grafana. We're using this internally, we're really excited about it. A huge shout out to Eric, who's been instrumental in driving this forward. So, as I say, you have a look at the docs. We've hopefully got stuff to help you get started. There's some advanced topics that you might want to consider once you've got this basic plugin running. I have to just kind of skip through these, apologies, but we'll make the slides available. 1 or 2 minutes, but that's not precise. Okay.
I mean, that can be precise.
No, that's good. So very quickly, template variables make it easy to kind of like build that interactive experience. So if you saw Chris's talk, he did a good job of showing that. Makes it easier to share dashboards. So you can have a template variable on a server name and then just have a very generic dashboard that can be used across places. Macros, similar to template variables, but they're executed on the back end, and it makes the query more dynamic. So you can respond to like changes in the time picker. So like, what is your dashboard meant to be looking at? Alerting, you literally just have to add backend equals true, alerting equals true in your plugin JSON, and you're good to go. UI extensions we've covered. Plugins can also bundle dashboards. So if you have a sample dashboard that makes it easy to use your data source, you can ship that as part of your plugin. Then users can import it. Provisioning, we've recently built on more in Create Plugin. So this basically allows you to have everything you need to run end-to-end tests or have like a realistic workflow installed in that Docker environment. If you do that, we can use it as a test environment. When you submit it to the catalog, it makes our test times a lot shorter, so things get published faster. Speaking of the catalog, why would you do this? Once you've got a plugin, you want to share it with the world, you want to make it easy to install by everyone, you can submit it to the Grafana plugins catalog for your Grafana.com account. When you do this, it gets reviewed by our team, so we'll make sure it's not doing anything too dangerous, or if it's like going to provide a good user experience. It then makes it more easy for folks to install it and to find it and hopefully collaborate. It's very easy to do. You can package it as a zip using the release workflow that we talked about. You submit it using that button, and then you sign it. If you wanted to talk about signatures, come chat to me or read that doc. And very quick reference things. New documentation. We really do recognize that our docs needed improvement, and we will continue to work on that. If you have missing content, come yell at me. I will make it happen. But we have a new developer portal. We're putting everything there. Includes our new design system, which has recently been launched. So if you want to see how Grafana recommends you build UIs, you can follow the same patterns that we're using today. Includes Storybook for all the UI components in Grafana UI, and the scenes documentation. More links, go find them later. There we go, just about on time. Come chat to us.